Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Today we'll delve into the misty Appalachian Mountains, where the wind carries ancient secrets, and where a bride disappeared not only from life, but also from official records. If you're joining us from anywhere in the world, leave a comment saying where you're watching from. This connection keeps us alive in this search for the truth. Asheville, North Carolina, a town nestled among mist-shrouded peaks, where ancient trees whisper stories no one else dares to tell. In 1856, this place was a transit point for merchants, a refuge for families seeking a fresh start, and a stage for mysteries that defied all logic. Dirt roads snaked through the dense forest, connecting isolated villages where everyone knew everyone else, or at least thought they did. It was in this setting that Eleanor Whitmore arrived in town one October afternoon. She came from Richmond, Virginia, carrying only a worn leather suitcase and a birth certificate attesting to her 23 years of age. Eleanor had clear eyes that seemed to reflect the light in a peculiar, almost ghostly way. Her navy blue dress was dusty from the long carriage journey, but she maintained an upright, dignified posture, as if carrying a purpose that no one could see. She was searching for Thomas Hartwell, a lumber merchant who had promised marriage by mail. The letters exchanged between them over 6 months painted a promising future: a house by the French Broad River, a simple but secure life, far from the social pressures of Richmond. Thomas was described as a serious, hard-working man, respected in the local community. Eleanor believed she was taking the right step, escaping a past she never mentioned in detail. When she finally met Thomas at the Central Inn in Asheville, something shifted in the air. Witnesses reported a brief, almost cold conversation between the two. Thomas seemed nervous, constantly averting his gaze. Eleanor maintained a forced smile, as if trying to convince herself that everything was all right. They agreed to marry the following morning in a simple ceremony at the local Baptist church. No grand celebration, just the necessary witnesses and an official registration at the Buncombe County Courthouse. But the following morning brought something unexpected. Eleanor appeared at the church punctually, dressed in a simple white dress she had sewn herself. Thomas, however, arrived almost an hour late, accompanied by 2 men no one in town knew. Reverend Josiah Mills conducted the ceremony quickly, without the traditional vows, without the elaborate blessings. Everything happened in less than 15 minutes. Eleanor signed the marriage register with trembling hands, her handwriting almost illegible. And then, something extraordinary happened. Or rather, it didn't happen. The document signed by Eleanor never reached the official registry office. Reverend Mills claimed to have personally delivered the papers to the clerk in charge, but when authorities checked weeks later, there was no record of any marriage between Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Hartwell. It was as if that ceremony had never taken place. In the following days, Eleanor was rarely seen in the city. Residents reported seeing her walking alone along the trails leading to the higher mountains, always at dusk, when the shadows lengthened and the cold began to bite. She seemed to be looking for something, or perhaps running from something. No one could say for sure. Thomas, for his part, became increasingly reclusive. He shut himself away on his property and refused visitors. When confronted about Eleanor's whereabouts, he would only repeat that she had left, returned to Virginia, but no carriage or stagecoach recorded her departure. No ticket was purchased in her name. Eleanor Whitmore simply ceased to exist in the official records and in the collective memory of Asheville. The town began to whisper. Some voices spoke of an ancient curse that haunted brides who dared to defy preordained destinies. Others mentioned indigenous legends about female spirits that inhabited the mountains, seducing travelers into an eternal sleep among the trees. But the most unsettling theory came from a washerwoman named Sarah Drummond, who swore she had seen Eleanor on the banks of the French Broad River on a new moon night, conversing with shadows that had no human form. What really happened to Eleanor Whitmore? Why was her marriage erased from the records? And who were those 2 unknown men who accompanied Thomas to the ceremony? The answers would begin to emerge in fragments, like pieces of a macabre puzzle that no one wanted to assemble. Asheville would keep this secret for decades, until forgotten documents in a dusty basement revealed a truth even darker than any local legend could imagine. The months that followed Eleanor's disappearance brought a strange atmosphere to Asheville. The city, accustomed to its predictable rhythms, began to feel the weight of something inexplicable. Shopkeepers closed their stores earlier, families avoided walking alone at nightfall, and the name Eleanor Whitmore became a forbidden whisper in conversations in the central square. Thomas Hartwell continued his routine of working with wood, but something had changed in him. His movements were mechanical, his eyes empty. The employees who worked in his sawmill commented among themselves about strange behaviors. Thomas would often stop in the middle of a task and stare fixedly at the mountains as if expecting to see someone emerge from the mist. In 1857, he began to drink frequently, something unusual for a man who was previously known for his temperance. It was Martha Kenley, the owner of the boarding house where Eleanor had spent her first night in Asheville, who brought to light an intriguing detail. While tidying the room weeks after Eleanor's departure, Martha found hidden behind a loose board a small diary bound in brown leather. The pages contained notes written in hurried handwriting, dated from the days before the wedding. Eleanor wrote about her fears, about premonitions that tormented her during the journey from Richmond. One entry in particular stood out. Eleanor mentioned receiving an anonymous letter 2 days before leaving Virginia, warning her not to go through with the marriage. The letter spoke of other women who had disappeared under similar circumstances in the Appalachian region, always involving arranged marriages by mail. The sender did not identify themselves, but used a postage stamp from Knoxville, Tennessee, a city west of Asheville. Martha took the diary to the local sheriff, Cornelius Wade, a middle-aged man known for his cautious and methodical approach. Wade examined the document with increasing attention. He noticed that Eleanor had written down the names of the 2 unknown men who accompanied Thomas to the ceremony, Samuel Crow and Nathaniel Voss. These names were unfamiliar to anyone in Asheville, but a search of the lodging records revealed that both had checked into an inn near the Tennessee border, arriving just 1 day before the wedding. Sheriff Wade decided to investigate further. He traveled to Knoxville in February 1857, braving muddy roads and the biting mountain cold. There, he spoke with local authorities and discovered something disturbing. In the last 5 years, at least 4 women had disappeared after moving to small towns in the Appalachians to marry men they had met through letters. They all had something in common. They came from larger cities, had no close family, and disappeared weeks after the supposed wedding ceremony. The pattern was eerily similar. In each case, the marriage was performed quickly, with few witnesses, and the official records either disappeared or contained inconsistencies. The grooms, questioned later, claimed that the women had left voluntarily, returning to their places of origin. But none of them were ever seen again by acquaintances or distant relatives. Wade returned to Asheville with a grim theory forming in his mind. He suspected he was dealing with something bigger than a simple disappearance, something organized and deliberate. But proving anything would be extremely difficult. There were no bodies, no reliable witnesses, and the men involved were cautious enough not to leave clear evidence. When he confronted Thomas Hartwell again, this time with more solid information, the lumber merchant stuck to his story. Eleanor had left, plain and simple, but his voice trembled as he spoke, and his hands were visibly sweating. Wade realized that Thomas knew more than he admitted, but without concrete proof. He couldn't arrest him or force him to confess. The investigation seemed to have reached a dead end, until Sarah Drummond, the laundress who claimed to have seen Eleanor on the riverbank, approached the sheriff with an unexpected revelation. Sarah confessed that she had in fact seen more than shadows that night. She saw Eleanor being led by 3 men toward an abandoned cabin on the higher slopes, a place known locally as Crow Point, due to the flocks of black crows that always circled the area. Sarah had initially lied out of fear, but the weight of her conscience was consuming her. She described the men in detail. One was definitely Thomas, another was tall and thin, wearing a dark overcoat, and the third was robust with a thick beard. The descriptions perfectly matched Samuel Crow and Nathaniel Voss. Sheriff Wade organized an expedition to Crow Point. It was March of 1857, and snow still partially covered the higher trails. The cabin Sarah had mentioned was there, partially hidden by dense pine trees. The structure was in ruins, with rotting boards and a roof that barely held up. Inside, investigators found signs of recent occupation: cold ashes in a makeshift fireplace, rope marks on the wooden beams, and something that made Wade's blood run cold: pieces of navy blue fabric, the same color as the dress Eleanor wore when she arrived in Asheville. But there was nothing more, no other trace, no clue as to what happened next. The cabin guarded its secrets with the same stubbornness as the surrounding mountains. The discovery at Crow Point completely changed the course of the investigation. Sheriff Wade knew he now had enough evidence to pressure Thomas Hartwell and find the other 2 men involved. But the task would be more complicated than he imagined. Samuel Crowe and Nathaniel Voss had disappeared from the area shortly after their wedding, and no one could provide accurate information about their whereabouts. Wade decided to adopt a different strategy. Instead of confronting Thomas directly, he began investigating his past, searching for connections that could explain his involvement in that dark plot. What he discovered was disturbing. Thomas was not originally from Asheville. He had arrived in the city in 1854, coming from a small town called Greenville in eastern Tennessee. There he worked as a carpenter and maintained contact with a restricted circle of acquaintances. In the records of the Greenville Baptist Church, Wade found something revealing. Thomas had previously been married in 1853 to a woman named Abigail Morse. She had come from Charleston, South Carolina, also through correspondence marriage. The marriage lasted only 3 months before Abigail supposedly left to return to her hometown, claiming she couldn't adapt to life in the mountains. But, like Eleanor, Abigail never arrived in Charleston. Her distant relatives never heard from her again. The pattern was becoming too clear to be a coincidence. Wade realized he was facing something systematic, an operation that likely involved multiple participants and extended across different counties. Lonely men lured women without strong family ties through romantic letters, promising marriage and security. But something sinister happened soon after the ceremony. In April 1857, Wade received an unexpected letter. The sender was a deputy from Jonesboro, Tennessee, named Henry Blackwood. Blackwood had read about Eleanor's case in the regional newspapers and recognized similarities to a disappearance he had investigated 2 years earlier. A woman named Lydia Fairchild had traveled from Raleigh, North Carolina, to marry a blacksmith in Jonesboro. She disappeared weeks later, and the blacksmith claimed she had run off with another man. Blackwood never believed this version, but he couldn't find any evidence to refute it. The two investigators decided to join forces. Through correspondence and mutual visits, they began to map a network of disappearances that stretched across the Appalachian region. They identified at least 7 cases in the last 8 years, all following the same chilling pattern: women who came from afar, hasty marriages, records that disappeared or contained errors, and unexplained disappearances. What intrigued Wade and Blackwood most was the question of the marriage records. Why were the documents disappearing? Who had access to them, and who had an interest in deleting them? The answer came from an unlikely source: a former clerk from the Buncombe Registry Office who had retired in 1856, the very year Eleanor disappeared. The man, named Ezra Pemberton, approached Wade on a rainy afternoon in May. Ezra was visibly nervous, his hands trembling as he held a yellowed envelope. He confessed that for years he had accepted bribes to make marriage records disappear. The money always came through an intermediary, a man Ezra knew only as the lawyer from Knoxville. He never asked questions about the motive, simply accepting the payment and removing the documents from the official files. Ezra handed Wade the envelope he had kept all these years. Inside were copies of 3 marriage records he had removed, including those of Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Hartwell, but there was something else. Handwritten notes in the margins of the documents, numbers that looked like dollar amounts and dates that didn't match the marriages. Wade realized he was looking at some kind of accounting, a record of financial transactions. The revelation was shocking. The marriages weren't the ultimate goal, but rather part of a larger scheme involving money. Wade began to formulate a theory. The women were lured with promises of marriage, and after the ceremonies, something happened that allowed the men involved to profit in some way. But how? What was so valuable about these women that justified such an elaborate and dangerous operation? The answer began to emerge when Wade investigated Thomas Hartwell's financial history more thoroughly. He discovered that, shortly after Eleanor's disappearance, Thomas had made a significant deposit at the local bank, $800, a substantial sum for the time. When questioned about the origin of the money, Thomas claimed it was from the sale of lumber, but the business records did not corroborate this story. Wade also discovered that Samuel Crowe and Nathaniel Voss were known in Knoxville's criminal circles. Crowe had a history of fraud involving property and inheritance, while Voss was suspected of involvement in document forgery schemes. Both had connections to a law firm that handled inheritance and will matters, exactly the type of business that could benefit from stolen identities or manipulation of civil records. The final piece of the puzzle was beginning to fall into place. The women were not chosen randomly. They were selected because they possessed something of value: inherited property, bank accounts, insurance policies, or land rights. After the marriages, the men involved legally assumed control of these assets, and the women simply disappeared, unable to contest the transfers. But a terrible question still haunted Wade. What really happened to these women afterward? Where were their bodies? Why had no one ever found concrete evidence of their fates? The Appalachian Mountains are vast and unforgiving, capable of hiding secrets for generations. And perhaps that was precisely the intention. With Ezra Pemberton's revelations and the financial connections mapped out, Sheriff Wade knew he needed to act quickly. The scheme was broader and more sophisticated than any crime he had faced before. It wasn't just about isolated disappearances, but a criminal network operating across state lines, exploiting flaws in registration systems and the vulnerability of women seeking a fresh start. In June 1857, Wade traveled to Knoxville, accompanied by Deputy Blackwood. They needed to identify the mysterious lawyer mentioned by Ezra and understand how the operation worked behind the scenes. Knoxville was a larger city than Asheville, with busy streets and a thriving commercial center. The law office that dealt with inheritances and wills was located in a red brick building near the Knox County Courthouse. The lead attorney was a man named Harlan Pritchard, respected in the community and known for his meticulous work with estate matters. Pritchard was about 50 years old, with gray hair combed back and an intimidating air of authority. Wade and Blackwood couldn't simply break into his office without concrete evidence, so they decided to observe him discreetly, mapping his routines and visitors. For 2 weeks, they followed Pritchard from afar. The lawyer kept a predictable schedule. He arrived at the office in the morning, met with clients during the day, and often dined at an elegant restaurant near the Tennessee River. But there was something peculiar about his Thursdays. On that particular day, Pritchard always left the office at noon and walked to a less reputable tavern on the outskirts of town, a place frequented by gamblers and merchants of dubious reputation. It was there that Wade and Blackwood finally saw the connection they were looking for. On a hot July afternoon, they observed Pritchard meeting with Samuel Crow at a secluded table at the back of the tavern. The conversation lasted almost an hour, and although they couldn't hear what they were saying, the exchange of an envelope between the two men was unmistakable. Crow placed the envelope in the inside pocket of his coat and left through the back door, disappearing into the narrow streets. Wade knew he needed something more concrete to build a case against Pritchard. He needed documents, written evidence connecting the lawyer to the disappearances. With the help of a sympathetic judge in Knoxville, he obtained a limited search warrant to examine the public files Pritchard kept related to inheritance cases processed in recent years. What they found was revealing. Pritchard had processed numerous property transfers involving newlywed women who were later declared to have abandoned their homes. In each case, the husbands presented documents claiming that their wives had left voluntarily, relinquishing their rights to property and assets. With these declarations, Pritchard facilitated the legal transfer of assets to the husbands, who subsequently sold or transferred them to third parties, always in exchange for a generous commission for the lawyer. The amounts were staggering. Over the past 5 years, Pritchard had facilitated transfers totaling more than $15,000, a considerable fortune for the time. And each of these transfers coincided temporally with one of the disappearances mapped by Wade and Blackwood. The most disturbing discovery came when they specifically examined the case of Eleanor Whitmore. Before leaving Richmond, Eleanor had inherited a small property from a distant aunt, a plot of land with a modest house valued at approximately $200. She had mentioned this inheritance in her letters to Thomas, seeing it as her contribution to the new home they would build together. Just 3 weeks after her disappearance, documents were presented in the Richmond court, stating that Eleanor had sold the property to Thomas Hartwell for $500, a price far below market value. The signature on the sales document was Eleanor's, but handwriting experts whom Wade later consulted pointed out significant inconsistencies when compared to authentic samples from the diary found in the boarding house. The signature had been forged, likely by Nathaniel Voss, the expert in fraudulent documents. Wade finally had a solid case. He presented his findings to the Knoxville district attorney, an upright man named William Stanton. Stanton was shocked by the extent of the scheme and agreed to convene a grand jury to formally investigate Harlan Pritchard, Thomas Hartwell, Samuel Crow, and Nathaniel Voss. But before formal charges could be filed, something unexpected happened. In August 1857, Thomas Hartwell was found on his property in Asheville in a state of extreme distress. Neighbors reported hearing screams coming from his house the previous night. When Sheriff Wade arrived at the scene, he found Thomas sitting on the floor of his living room, staring blankly into space, muttering incoherent words. Thomas was clearly suffering some kind of mental breakdown. He continually repeated Eleanor's name, interspersed with pleas for forgiveness. Wade tried to question him, but Thomas oscillated between moments of lucidity and others of total confusion. In his clearer moments, he began to reveal fragments of what had actually happened, but always stopped before completing his confessions, as if something prevented him from continuing. A local doctor examined Thomas and diagnosed a severe nervous condition, possibly caused by prolonged guilt and stress. He was taken to an institution in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he could receive proper care. But before leaving, Thomas handed Wade a rusty key, saying only, "Truth lies where crows rest." Wade knew immediately what Thomas was referring to, Raven's Point. There was something more to that abandoned cabin, something they hadn't found on their first search. The key belonged to some hidden chest or compartment, a place where the real secrets were kept. Wade decided to return to that dark place in the mountains, but this time he would take a larger team and the proper tools for a thorough search. Whatever was hidden there might finally reveal the fate of Eleanor and the other missing women. The second expedition to Crow Point was organized for early September 1857. Sheriff Wade gathered 6 trusted men, including Deputy Blackwood, who had traveled especially from Jonesboro to participate in the search. They took lanterns, digging tools, and ropes, prepared for a thorough investigation of that isolated area in the mountains. The path to the abandoned cabin seemed even more sinister this time. The trees formed a dense canopy that blocked the sunlight, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of the crows that gave the place its name. When they reached the ruined structure, Wade felt a weight in his chest, a sense that they were about to discover something that would change everything. The key Thomas had handed over was small and old, the kind used on chest or pantry door locks. The men began to methodically search for any locked structure. It was one of the helpers who noticed something peculiar. One of the floorboards in the cabin sounded hollow when stepped on. Carefully removing the rotten wood, they revealed a compartment carved into the floor, protected by a solid wooden lid with a rusty padlock. Thomas's key fit perfectly. Wade opened the compartment, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a metal box, about the size of a small toolbox. The surface was covered in rust and dirt, but it was still sealed. Carefully he brought it to the surface and opened it under the filtered light that filtered through the cracks in the cabin. The contents were unsettling in their simplicity. Documents, dozens of documents, carefully organized and protected from moisture by waxed cloth wrappers. There were birth certificates, property deeds, insurance policies, and personal letters. Each set belonged to a different woman. Wade immediately recognized Eleanor Whitmore's documents, but there were many more. Abigail Morse, Lydia Fairchild, and 5 other women whose names he didn't yet know. Alongside the personal documents were meticulous accounting records, written in the precise handwriting that Wade recognized from Harlan Pritchard's files. These were ledgers detailing values, dates, and names in code. With some effort, Wade managed to decipher the system. Each woman was identified by a number, and next to it were listed the values of her assets before and after the transactions. The sums were divided among multiple participants, with the largest percentage always going to someone identified only as H.P. Sack, clearly Harlan Pritchard. But the most unsettling item in the box was a notebook bound in black leather. Inside, handwritten, were detailed accounts of how each woman had been lured, married, and subsequently prevented from contesting the property transfers. The tone was cold, almost clinical, as if describing common business transactions. There was no explicit mention of the women's ultimate fate, only notes stating that they had been removed from the equation or neutralized as a problem. Wade felt nauseous as he read those pages. He held in his hands proof of a calculated and cruel criminal operation that treated human lives as mere obstacles to financial gain. But the answer to the most important question remained. Where were these women now? Delegate Blackwood, examining the compartment more closely, noticed something the others had missed. On the inside wall of the excavated hole, there were marks carved into the compacted earth. They looked like rudimentary arrows, all pointing in the same direction, deeper, downwards. Something else was buried there. With shovels and makeshift tools, They began to dig. The soil was hard, mixed with stones and ancient roots. After digging about half a meter, one of the shovels struck something solid that wasn't stone. It was wood, smooth and worked. Removing more dirt around it, they revealed what appeared to be a horizontal wooden cover, like the entrance to an underground cellar or basement. Wade ordered caution. They thoroughly cleaned around the structure and found rusty hinges and an iron ring to pull. With combined effort, they lifted the heavy lid, revealing a rough staircase that descended into darkness. The air that emerged was cold and heavy, with a smell of damp earth and old mold. Lighting lanterns, Wade went down first, followed by Blackwood and 2 other men. The staircase had approximately 10 steps and led to a chamber dug into the earth, with walls reinforced by wooden planks. The ceiling was low, forcing them to stoop. The space was about 3 meters long by 2 meters wide, clearly intentionally constructed for some specific purpose. The chamber walls showed signs of use. There were rope marks on the wooden supports, dark stains on the earthen floor, and remnants of decaying fabric in the corners. But there was nothing else. No human remains, no direct evidence of what had happened there. The chamber had been meticulously cleaned, probably after each use. However, the existence of that underground prison was sufficient proof of sinister intentions. Wade imagined Eleanor and the other women being held there, isolated and terrified, while their belongings were transferred and their documents falsified. What happened next remained a mystery, but the deliberate and organized nature of it all pointed to a fate he preferred not to fully imagine. Upon returning to the surface, Wade ordered everything to be documented and photographed. A traveling photographer in Asheville was hired to record the scene, creating visual evidence that could be presented to the court. The documents from the metal box were carefully packed and taken into Wade's direct custody. With this evidence in hand, he knew he finally had what he needed to bring justice, but he also knew the legal battle would be difficult. Harlan Pritchard was influential and had powerful connections. Samuel Crowe and Nathaniel Voss were slippery and would probably already be planning to flee as soon as they knew the investigation had progressed so far. Thomas Hartwell was confined to an institution and might never regain enough sanity to testify. The truth had been revealed, but securing convictions would be a completely different challenge. And above all, the question of the ultimate fate of the missing women remained, a secret the Appalachian Mountains seemed determined to keep forever. Wade's return to Asheville with the evidence marked the beginning of one of the most complex criminal investigations ever conducted in the Appalachian region. Prosecutor William Stanton, now fully convinced of the gravity of the case, mobilized resources from 3 different states, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. The magnitude of the scheme demanded unprecedented cooperation between jurisdictions that rarely worked together. In October 1857, arrest warrants were issued simultaneously for Harlan Pritchard, Samuel Crowe, and Nathaniel Voss. The operation was planned to take place at dawn, minimizing the chances of escape. Pritchard was found at his residence in Knoxville, an imposing 2-story house with manicured gardens. He received the officers with disconcerting calm, almost as if he had expected that moment. He donned his best suit, arranged his personal documents, and proceeded without resistance. Samuel Crowe did not display the same composure. He was located in a boarding house in Bristol, on the Tennessee-Virginia border, clearly preparing to leave. When officers knocked on the door, he tried to escape through the back window, but was captured after a brief chase through the muddy streets. In his room were found false documents with different identities and a considerable amount of money, more than $1,500 in bills from various banks. Nathaniel Voss proved to be the most elusive of the 3. He had completely disappeared, leaving Knoxville weeks earlier, apparently alerted to the progress of the investigation. Wade issued circulars to all police precincts and sheriff's offices between Georgia and Pennsylvania, but Voss seemed to have vanished into thin air. His expertise in forgery likely allowed him to travel under different names, making his capture extremely difficult. The trial of Harlan Pritchard and Samuel Crowe was scheduled for January 1858 in Knoxville, chosen because it was the jurisdiction with the most documentary evidence. The case attracted regional attention, with newspapers from various cities sending correspondents to cover what was already being called the Appalachian bride scandal. Pritchard's defense was handled by 2 experienced Nashville lawyers known for their skill in creating reasonable doubt. Their strategy was clear from the start: admit that Pritchard had facilitated property transfers, but claim that everything was done legally. based on documents he believed to be authentic. Regarding the women's disappearances, the defense argued that there was no proof of any crime, only circumstantial evidence and assumptions. Samuel Crowe, on the other hand, remained silent throughout the initial proceedings. His lawyer, a young and inexperienced court-appointed attorney, merely repeated that his client denied any involvement in criminal acts and that his presence at the weddings was coincidental. Prosecutor Stanton built his case methodically. He presented the documents found in the metal box, showing a clear pattern of fraud and conspiracy. Handwriting experts testified about the forgeries in the signatures. Ezra Pemberton, the former clerk, publicly confessed to his role in removing marriage records in exchange for bribes, identifying Pritchard as the source of the payments. Martha Kenley brought Eleanor's diary and testified about the young woman's emotional state before the wedding. Sarah Drummond described what she saw that night on the river, identifying the three men. The photographer presented images of the cabin at Crow Point and the underground chamber, causing a commotion in the courtroom. But the most dramatic moment came when they brought Thomas Hartwell in as a witness. He had improved slightly under medical care, although he still showed signs of emotional instability. With a trembling voice and frequent pauses, Thomas confessed his participation in the scheme. He explained how he was recruited by Pritchard through Samuel Crowe, initially seduced by the promise of easy money to pay off gambling debts. Thomas described how the operation worked. He wrote romantic letters to lonely women in distant cities, specifically those whose newspaper advertisements indicated they owned property or inheritances. After establishing correspondence, he invited them to marry, ensuring they came alone and without informing many people. After the ceremonies, the women were taken to Ravens Point under some pretext, kept in the underground chamber while their documents were forged and their properties transferred. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the judge asked, "What happened to these women after the transfers were completed?" Thomas began to answer, but his voice failed him. Tears streamed down his face. He opened his mouth several times, trying to form words, but nothing came out. Finally, he collapsed, being carried out of the room in a state of collapse. That unanswered question hung over the courtroom like a dark cloud. Everyone understood the implication, but without an explicit confession or the discovery of human remains, the prosecutor could not formally charge the defendants with murder. The charges remained focused on fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and kidnapping. The defense argued that without bodies, without direct witnesses to violence, and without a full confession, there was no proof that any woman had been killed. They could have been released in remote locations, could have started new lives under different names, could have had any fate that did not involve death. It was a technically valid argument, although morally repugnant. The jury deliberated for 3 full days. The courtroom was packed when they returned with the verdict in February 1858. Harlan Pritchard was found guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and facilitating kidnapping. Samuel Crowe received a similar verdict, with the addition of attempted escape from justice. The sentences were heavy. Pritchard received 20 years in prison, Crowe received 15. But there was no conviction for murder. Technically, in the eyes of the law, Eleanor Whitmore and the other women were still missing, not dead. It was a bitter legal victory, which left Wade and many others with the feeling that complete justice had not been achieved. The victims' estranged families received some solace in knowing that those responsible had been punished, but the lack of definitive closure on the fate of their relatives would continue to haunt them for years. The years that followed the trial brought significant changes to Asheville and the surrounding communities. The case of the missing brides left a deep mark on the region, altering how people viewed mail-order marriages and the trust placed in strangers. Regional newspapers published series of articles warning women about the dangers of accepting proposals from unknown men, and authorities began implementing more rigorous checks on marriage records. Thomas Hartwell never fully recovered. He spent the rest of his days in the institution in Charlotte, oscillating between periods of lucidity and others of profound melancholy. In his occasional letters to Sheriff Wade, he repeatedly expressed regret, but never completed the confession he had begun in court. He died in 1863, taking with him the final details that could have brought peace to the victims' families. Harlan Pritchard served his sentence in Tennessee State Penitentiary with his arrogance intact. He maintained regular correspondence with associates in the legal world, always protesting his partial innocence and claiming to have been merely an ill-informed intermediary. When he was released in 1878, After 20 years, he was an old and broken man, shunned by all who knew his story. He moved to a small town in Kentucky, where he lived his last years in relative anonymity. Passing away in 1882, Samuel Crowe served 12 years before being released for good behavior in 1870. Unlike Pritchard, Crowe disappeared completely after leaving prison. Occasional rumors placed him in different states, always involved in minor fraud schemes, but nothing was ever confirmed. He became a sort of ghost, a name whispered in cautionary tales. Nathaniel Voss, the only one who escaped justice, remained a fugitive. Over the years, Wade received unconfirmed reports of his presence in places as far away as Louisiana and Michigan, but each time local authorities investigated, the suspect had left. In 1869, a man identified as Voss was supposedly seen in San Francisco, California, working under a false name as a clerk in an immigration office. But when officials arrived to investigate, they found no one matching the description. Crow Point became a place avoided by the local population. The cabin was officially sealed off by the authorities in 1858, and the underground chamber was filled with earth and rocks. But even decades later, residents reported feelings of unease when passing near that area. Hunters preferred to avoid that trail, and parents warned their children never to venture alone in that direction of the mountains. Wade continued as sheriff of Asheville until 1865, when he decided to retire. The case of the missing brides deeply affected him, and he devoted much of his free time in the following years to trying to solve the ultimate mystery. Where were Eleanor and the other women? He organized multiple searches in the areas around Crow Point, consulted old maps looking for caves or natural burial sites, and interviewed anyone who might have information. In 1872, Wade received an anonymous letter that rekindled his research. The sender, who identified himself only as a repentant man, claimed to have knowledge of the women's fate. The letter instructed Wade to search in a specific place, a deep ravine about 5 kilometers north of Crow Point, known locally as Echo Gorge because of the peculiar sound the wind made as it passed through it. Wade, now 62 years old but still determined, organized an expedition to the aforementioned location. The Echo Gorge was a crevice in the rock that dropped abruptly for almost 30 meters, with steep walls covered in dense vegetation. It was a dangerous place, rarely visited, and perfect for hiding secrets that should not be discovered. Using ropes and appropriate equipment, a team carefully descended to the bottom of the ravine. What they found was both revealing and insufficient. There were remnants of personal items scattered among the rocks, a partially preserved wooden comb, fragments of fabric that could have been worn, rusty metal buttons, and pieces of leather that appeared to have come from suitcases or bags. But there was nothing conclusive, nothing that could definitively confirm that this was the final resting place of the missing women. Years and the elements had deteriorated any organic evidence, and nature had reclaimed the space, covering it with layers of fallen leaves, branches, and new growth. Wade collected the objects found, meticulously documented everything, but knew that even this discovery wouldn't bring the complete closure the families deserved. The anonymous letter was never traced back to its author. Wade suspected it might have been from Nathaniel Voss, perhaps seeking some form of redemption in his final years, or possibly from someone who had served as an occasional helper in the scheme and carried the weight of guilt. But this remained mere speculation. The objects found in Echo Gorge were catalogued and stored in the Buncombe County Archives. The wooden comb was identified by a distant cousin of Lydia Fairchild as similar to one she owned. One of the metal buttons matched the description of a set Eleanor had mentioned in her diary as part of her traveling dress. These were tenuous connections, but enough for Wade to believe he had finally found where the story ended for those women. In 1875, Wade erected a small, unassuming memorial near the entrance to Echo Gorge. It was a simple stone plaque with an inscription, "In memory of those who journeyed seeking hope and found only silence, never forgotten." He didn't include names, as he wasn't entirely certain, but the gesture brought some comfort to the few families still searching for answers. Sheriff Wade died in 1879 at the age of 69, having dedicated a significant portion of his life to seeking justice for Eleanor Whitmore and the other victims of the shadowy scheme that haunted Appalachia. His successor inherited the case files, but with the main culprits already punished or missing, the investigation was officially considered closed, although technically it remained unsolved. The legacy of the case extended far beyond the lives of those directly involved. As the decades passed, the story of Eleanor Whitmore and the other missing women transformed into something larger than the documented facts, becoming part of the dark folklore of the Appalachians. But behind the legends that would emerge, an important historical truth remained about vulnerability, exploitation, and the failures of the systems that should protect the most vulnerable. In 1889, a journalist named Rebecca Thornton from Charleston visited Asheville while researching forgotten stories of the American South. She discovered the Wade case files in the Buncombe County records and became fascinated by the complexity and systematic nature of the scheme. Rebecca spent 3 months interviewing survivors from that time, collecting documents and reconstructing the complete narrative. Her work resulted in a series of articles published in the Charleston Mercury that brought renewed attention to the case. Rebecca's articles were remarkable not only for their meticulous research, but for their focus on the victims as real people with dreams and aspirations, not just statistics in a criminal record. She uncovered details about Eleanor's life before she arrived in Asheville, how she had worked as a seamstress in Richmond, how she loved reading poetry by candlelight, how she dreamed of having her own family after years of caring for elderly relatives. Rebecca humanized Eleanor and the other women in a way that legal documents never could. Rebecca's research also revealed something disturbing that the original investigators hadn't fully grasped. The scheme had likely been operating for much longer than previously thought. She found references in old Charleston and Savannah newspapers to similar disappearances dating back to 1847, almost a decade before Eleanor's case. Women responding to marriage ads, traveling to meet grooms in the mountains, and simply vanishing. At the time, these cases were treated as isolated incidents, women who supposedly changed their minds or left for other destinations. If these connections were correct, the number of victims could be significantly higher than the 8 women identified during the original investigation. Rebecca estimated, based on patterns and timelines, that there could have been 15 or even 20 women over 11 years. The scale of the criminal operation was frightening, suggesting a level of organization and protection that allowed it to continue for so long. Rebecca's articles generated heated debates about necessary reforms to civil and marriage registration systems. Activists began pushing for laws requiring waiting periods between announcements of intent to marry and actual ceremonies, allowing for background checks. Some states began implementing centralized registries that were more difficult to manipulate or make disappear. In 1893, the National Woman Suffrage Association used the case as an example of the vulnerabilities faced by women in societies where they had limited legal rights. Once married, women of the time automatically lost control over their property, which legally passed to their husbands. This legal system had facilitated Pritchard's scheme, making fraudulent transfers easier to execute and harder to contest. Meanwhile, in Asheville, the story was beginning to take on supernatural elements in the popular imagination. Older residents told younger ones about sightings of a female figure dressed in blue walking along the trails near Crow Point on foggy nights. Some claimed to hear female voices carried by the wind as the fog descended on the mountains, calling for help that would never come. These stories, though clearly embellished by superstition and time, reflected something deeper, the community's collective awareness that a terrible injustice had occurred there, and that it was never fully resolved. The fact that the women's bodies were never definitively found or identified left an open wound in the local historical memory. In 1901, during the construction of a new railroad crossing the mountains near Asheville, workers made a disturbing discovery. In a remote area about 8 kilometers northeast of the old Crow Point, while excavating to establish the foundation for a bridge, they found buried objects that appeared to be remnants of old personal belongings, fragments of mirrors, pieces of hairbrushes, more metal buttons, and fabrics partially preserved by the specific composition of the soil in that area. The engineer in charge of the project, a methodical man named Douglas Fairweather, recognized the potential historical significance of the discovery. He temporarily halted work and contacted local authorities. A retired investigator who had worked with Wade in his later years examined the objects and confirmed that they were consistent with the period and type of items the missing women would have possessed. This discovery suggested that perhaps Echo Gorge wasn't the only location used by the criminals, or that Wade had received partially incorrect information in the anonymous letter. The Appalachians are vast and full of remote places where secrets could be hidden forever. Each new discovery only underscored the scale of the operation and the impossibility of fully recovering the truth. Construction of the railroad continued, but the area where the objects were found was marked on official maps with a special annotation. Decades later, when that section of the railroad was decommissioned in 1947, local residents erected another small memorial, similar to the one Wade had created, recognizing that the ground held memories of past tragedies. At the beginning of the 20th century, historians began to study the case more academically, contextualizing it within the broader patterns of crime and exploitation in the 19th century. A professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill published a detailed study in 1912 called Crimes of Opportunity on the Mountain Frontiers, dedicating an entire chapter to the missing bride scheme. The study argued that cases like this were more common than official records suggested, especially in remote areas where law enforcement was limited and civil records were poor. Geographic isolation, combined with the population mobility of the time and the lack of rapid communication between jurisdictions, created ideal conditions for criminals to operate with relative impunity for extended periods. Eleanor Whitmore, specifically, became a symbol within this broader historical context. Her story represented thousands of women who, throughout the 19th century, traveled alone seeking better opportunities, only to discover that the world was more dangerous than they imagined. She was simultaneously specific in her individual details and universal in her representation of female vulnerability in an era of rapid social change. In 1925, the city of Asheville, now much larger and more modern than in Eleanor's time, held an official memorial ceremony on the approximate 70th anniversary of the events. City officials, descendants of Wade and Deputy Blackwood, and representatives of women's organizations gathered at the county courthouse to unveil a commemorative plaque. The inscription recognized the victims of the criminal scheme and honored those who worked tirelessly to bring those responsible to justice, even if only partially. The ceremony attracted the attention of regional newspapers, and for the first time in decades, the case returned to the headlines. Readers sent letters sharing family stories of relatives who had disappeared in similar circumstances in other parts of the South, suggesting that the phenomenon was even more widespread than had been documented. Some of these letters contained valuable information that modern historians would use to map criminal networks operating during that period. In the surviving archives, carefully preserved by the local historical society, remained the physical evidence of the case: Eleanor's diary, the documents found in the metal box, the photographs of the cabin and the underground chamber, the letters between Wade and other investigators. These items became educational resources used to teach about criminal history, women's rights, and the evolution of American justice systems. As the 20th century progressed, new generations of researchers remained fascinated by the case of Eleanor Whitmore and the missing brides of Appalachia. Each decade brought different perspectives, more sophisticated investigative methods, and renewed historical contexts that illuminated previously obscure aspects of that ancient tragedy. In 1956, exactly 100 years after Eleanor's disappearance, Duke University organized an academic symposium dedicated to unsolved historical crimes of the American South. The Appalachian brides case was presented as the central study, with historians, criminologists, and sociologists offering analyses from different angles. One of the most notable papers was presented by a doctoral candidate named Helena Marsh, who had dedicated 3 years to researching this case exclusively. Helena brought an innovative approach by applying psychological analysis to the profiles of the criminals involved. She extensively studied Harlan Pritchard's writings during his time in prison, the letters Thomas Hartwell sent to Wade, and trial testimonies. Her conclusion was that the scheme was not motivated solely by financial greed, but also by a perversion of power and control. The men involved, she argued, were attracted not only by profit, but by the absolute dominance they exerted over vulnerable lives. This psychological perspective added a deeper layer of understanding to why the scheme worked so efficiently for so long. It wasn't simply a crime of opportunity, but an operation that attracted specific personalities, individuals capable of compartmentalizing morality, of seeing other people as resources to be exploited, and of cooperating in secret while maintaining respectable social appearances. During her doctoral research, Helena made a surprising discovery in the archives of the Library of Congress in Washington. Among documents related to 19th century postal reforms, she found correspondence between regional postmasters discussing concerns about fraudulent marriage schemes operating through the postal system. One letter dated 1855 specifically mentioned the Appalachian region as an area of concern, with multiple accounts of women sending letters to addresses that later turned out to be false or abandoned. This discovery suggested that federal authorities were somewhat aware of the problem even before Eleanor's case became public, but lacked clear jurisdiction or resources to effectively investigate crimes that crossed state lines. The legal system at the time was simply not equipped to deal with interstate organized crime, a loophole that sophisticated criminals like Pritchard skillfully exploited. In 1968, an independent documentary filmmaker from Knoxville, named Martin Vickers, produced a short film about the case, using careful dramatizations and interviews with local historians. The film, titled Echoes from the Mountains, was shown at regional festivals and eventually acquired by an educational broadcaster that aired it several times during the 1970s. For many Americans, especially in more urban areas, it was the first time they had heard about this dark chapter in Appalachian history. Vickers' documentary inspired a new wave of public interest. University students began choosing the case as a topic for research papers. Book clubs discussed books that mentioned Eleanor and the circumstances of her disappearance. Online genealogy groups, which emerged with the expansion of the internet in the 1990s, began tracing possible descendants of the victims' families, creating family trees and connecting previously isolated family histories. One of these genealogical researchers, named Patricia Whitmore, discovered in 1997 that she was the great-great-granddaughter of a distant cousin of Eleanor. She was deeply moved upon learning about the fate of her ancestral relative and decided to make a pilgrimage to Asheville to visit the sites connected to the story. Patricia visited the courthouse where the trial had taken place, the site of Martha Kenley's former boarding house, and finally hiked the trails to where the old Ravens Point was located. The original cabin had long since vanished completely, reclaimed by the forest, but Patricia found the spot marked on a historical map preserved by the local historical society. Standing there among the ancient trees, surrounded by the distant call of crows, she felt a deep connection to Eleanor, a woman who had died more than 140 years before, but whose story still resonated through the generations. Patricia wrote a memoir called Searching for Eleanor, A Journey Through Time and Tragedy, published in 2003. The book combined family history, historical research, and personal reflection on how past tragedies continue to influence family identities in the present. She dedicated a portion of the book's profits to establishing a scholarship at the University of North Carolina for women studying history or criminal justice, specifically focused on unsolved historical cases involving female victims. In 2006, modern forensic technology finally offered new possibilities for the old case. A forensic anthropologist from the University of Tennessee proposed a scientific expedition to systematically examine Echo Gorge and other areas identified as potential sites of interest. Using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies, the team mapped subsurface anomalies that could indicate historical soil disturbances. The expedition found several areas of interest, but 150 years of natural processes, including erosion, root growth, and minor landslides, had drastically altered the topography. Soil tests revealed some chemical anomalies consistent with ancient organic decomposition, but nothing definitive enough to confirm the presence of human remains. The technology, while impressive, had limitations when applied to such ancient mysteries. Around that same time, an archivist working in Tennessee's state records made an intriguing discovery. Among documents related to the prison system, he found a set of letters written by Samuel Crow in the final years of his sentence, between 1868 and 1870. These letters were addressed to a prison chaplain and contained reflections on guilt, remorse, and the weight of secrets he carried. In a specific letter dated March 1869, Crow wrote enigmatically, "The mountains guard what has been taken, and only they know the whole truth. We were instruments of something greater than ourselves. An evil that fed on hope turned to despair. I see their faces every night, those women who believed in promises written on paper but empty of truth." These words were the closest thing to a direct admission of guilt that any of those involved had ever expressed in writing. While they did not provide specific details about individual fates, they confirmed what investigators had always suspected. The women had suffered terrible fates, and the men responsible carried this knowledge as a permanent psychological burden. In 2015, the city of Asheville, now a thriving tourist and cultural community, inaugurated a permanent memorial dedicated to Eleanor Whitmore and all the victims of unsolved historical crimes in the Appalachian region. The memorial consists of a tranquil plaza with stone benches arranged in a semicircle around a central fountain. Engraved on bronze plaques are the known names of the scheme's victims, including Eleanor, Abigail, Lydia, and 5 other women identified through historical research. An 8th plaque intentionally remains blank, representing all the victims whose names have been lost to time, whose stories were never fully told, whose absence left voids that no one could fill. The central inscription of the memorial simply reads, "They journeyed with hope. We remember them with reverence. Their stories teach us vigilance, compassion, and justice." The memorial has become a place of reflection for visitors and residents alike. School groups visit it as part of lessons on local history and civil rights. Organizations working with victims of modern human trafficking hold ceremonies there, drawing lines between past and present exploitation, reminding us that female vulnerability remains a reality that demands constant attention. The story of Eleanor Whitmore and the missing brides of Appalachia remains, even after so many decades, an enigma that will never be fully solved. The mountains of North Carolina guard their secrets with a tenacity that defies time, technology, and human persistence. And perhaps it is precisely this incompleteness that makes this narrative so disturbing and memorable. When we look back, through the dusty years that separate us from that somber October, we can try to imagine Eleanor stepping down from the carriage in Asheville, her clear eyes surveying a city that was completely foreign to her, her heart torn between hope and fear. She was just a woman seeking a fresh start, like thousands of others in American history. But the destiny that awaited her would transform her personal story into something much greater, a symbol of vulnerability and injustice that would resonate through generations. The unanswered questions are numerous and astonishing. What really happened in that underground chamber at Ravens Point? What were Eleanor's last words before disappearing from history? Did she have moments of realizing she had been deceived, that the romantic promises were merely elaborate bait? Did she feel absolute fear when she understood there was no escape? Or perhaps she held on to hope until the very last moment, believing it was all a terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved. We will never know, and this enforced ignorance leaves us with a profound unease, a feeling that the story remains incomplete, that justice, although partially served with the convictions of Pritchard and Crowe, never achieved its ultimate goal of bringing all the victims back into the light, of giving them full recognition, of allowing their families to finally find peace. Thomas Hartwell, in his mental breakdown and fragmented confessions, offered glimpses of genuine remorse. But remorse doesn't undo actions. It doesn't return stolen lives. It doesn't fill the voids left in family trees where women's names simply end without explanation, without descendants, without a proper narrative conclusion. Thomas died carrying secrets that could have alleviated the suffering of many, but he chose, consciously or unconsciously, to take those secrets with him to the grave. Harlan Pritchard, the cold and calculating architect behind the operation, never showed genuine remorse. Even in his prison writings, his words were always carefully constructed to minimize his guilt, to portray himself as a victim of circumstances or as an innocent intermediary in transactions he claimed not to fully understand. It was a false narrative he repeated until his last days, a lie he told primarily to himself, perhaps the only way he found to continue living with the weight of his choices. Samuel Crowe, whose letters to the prison chaplain offered the closest thing to the truth, vanished after his release like a ghost returning from the mist. He walked freely through the streets of America for unknown years, carrying memories of faces and voices that haunted his nights. Did he find some form of peace? Did he build a different life under a false name trying to escape his past? Or did the weight of guilt eventually consume him in ways we will never know? And Nathaniel Voss, the only one who was never captured, remains a permanent question mark in the story. He could have lived decades after the events, perhaps even reaching the turn of the 20th century, always looking over his shoulder, always changing cities when he suspected someone might recognize him. Or perhaps he met his own premature end in circumstances that were never connected back to the Asheville case. History is full of criminals who disappear without a trace, and Voss was just another one of them. Society has changed enormously since those days in the mid-19th century. Women have gained legal rights, financial autonomy, and protections that Eleanor and her contemporaries never had. Civil registration systems have become more robust, more difficult to manipulate. Instant communication through modern technology makes it almost impossible for someone to simply disappear without leaving a digital trace. And yet exploitation crimes continue to exist, merely adapted to new realities. Human vulnerability, unfortunately, is a constant throughout time. The Appalachian Mountains remain, eternal and indifferent to the small human tragedies that have occurred on their slopes. The trees that witnessed the events of 1856 are long gone, replaced by new generations of pines and oaks. The paths Eleanor traveled have been paved or abandoned. The cabin at Crow Point has dissolved back into the earth. But the memory persists, preserved in yellowed documents, in accounts passed down through generations, in stone memorials that mark places where secrets are buried. Contemporary visitors to Asheville rarely learn of this dark history. They come for the natural beauty, the vibrant art scene, the historic architecture, and the welcoming culture. They walk streets where Eleanor once walked, unaware that they are treading on layers of history that include not only prosperity and progress, but also darkness and tragedy. And perhaps that's for the best. Cities need to move forward, to build futures that aren't defined solely by their darkest pasts. But for those who know the history, who take the time to look beyond the surface, Eleanor Whitmore and the other missing women remain present in a ghostly way. They remind us that each era has its own forms of evil, its own systems of exploitation, its own victims whose voices are silenced by power and privilege. They remind us to ask who is vulnerable today, who is being exploited now, what contemporary stories are being silenced and will only be told decades in the future, when it is too late to make a real difference. The pursuit of justice undertaken by Sheriff Wade and Deputy Blackwood, though incomplete in its final results, represents something important about human persistence in the face of adversity. Wade could have given up when the leads ran out, when witnesses lied, when documents disappeared, but he continued, motivated not by glory or recognition, but by a deep sense of duty to those who could no longer speak for themselves. This kind of quiet dedication to justice rarely receives the headlines it deserves, but it forms the foundation upon which civilized societies are built. The families of the victims, geographically scattered and often lacking the resources or connections to seek answers, depended on men like Wade to be their voices. Many of them never knew what truly happened to their daughters, cousins, or sisters. They lived and died with the persistent hope that perhaps, somehow, their relatives were alive somewhere far away, having simply chosen not to return. Hope can be a comfort, but it can also be torture when it is never definitively confirmed nor denied. The documents that survive in historical archives are fragmentary and incomplete. Pages are missing, ink has faded, paper has deteriorated. But what remains is enough to reconstruct the general outlines of the story, to understand the nature of the scheme and the extent of the tragedy. Future historians, with access to technologies we cannot yet imagine, may be able to extract more information from these ancient documents, revealing layers of truth currently invisible. And who knows, in some distant future, an accidental discovery while building a new road or excavating for a building's foundations might finally reveal definitive physical evidence that closes this chapter once and for all. The mountains may eventually yield their secrets, forced by the inevitability of human progress and the relentless erosion of time. Or perhaps they never will, maintaining eternal silence about events that only the earth witnessed. What do we learn from stories like this? That trust is precious and should be granted cautiously. That social protection systems are essential precisely because not everyone acts in good faith. That vulnerability is not moral weakness, but a human condition that anyone can experience under the right circumstances. That justice, though often slow and incomplete, is always worth pursuing, and that memory matters, that telling stories of past injustices is not morbid but necessary to understand the present and build better futures. Eleanor Whitmore traveled to Asheville seeking love, safety, and a fresh start. She found only betrayal, exploitation, and an end that remains shrouded in mystery even after all these years. Her story is not unique in American history, but it is representative of countless others that were never documented, never investigated, never remembered. By telling her story, We honor not only Eleanor specifically, but all those whose names were lost, whose lives were discarded, whose voices were permanently silenced. The missing brides of Appalachia remain as silent witnesses to a time when distance meant true isolation, when communication was slow and uncertain, when women had few options and often risked everything for chances at happiness that sometimes proved to be mere cruel illusions. We now live in different times, but the human essence remains constant, capable of both great kindness and terrible evil, and so ends this journey through one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian history, a story of betrayed hope, interrupted lives, partial justice, and mysteries that time has not been able to fully resolve. Eleanor and the other women deserve to be remembered not only as victims, but as real people who lived, loved, dreamed, and had their stories brutally cut short by those who valued profit above humanity. If this story touched you in any way, if it brought about reflections on vulnerability, justice, or historical memory, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment sharing your thoughts. Stories like these need to be told and retold, not to glorify tragedy, but to ensure that we never forget the lessons the past has to teach us.